Today, we heard from political leaders who were silent during the first 3 days of upheaval in Ottawa. Protesters remain on Parliament Hill this hour, with Ottawa city officials saying today they have never seen this level of civil disobedience, and they don't know how or when it will end. The Premier issuing the statement today saying the right to peaceful protest is core to our Canadian identity. I was extremely disturbed, however, to see some individuals desecrate our most sacred monuments and wave swastikas and other symbols of hate and intolerance this weekend. That has no place in Ontario or Canada, not now, not ever.
Joining us now to discuss leadership in all of this, Liberal MPP for Ottawa South, John Fraser, NDP MPP for Ottawa Centre, Joel Harden, and we should also note we requested a PC MPP. We did not hear back from the government. So let's start with the Premier's statement and what we heard from the Prime Minister. Mr. Fraser, is it enough?
Well, no, it's not enough. And it's late. What was happening in Ottawa was going on for 2 days. And we saw all those symbols and those terrible things. And it wasn't just a few people. It was a core group of people who were, harassing people, beating up people at a food bank, taking our soup kitchen, taking away, property, harassing store owners. So it was very unruly behavior, intimidating people. So the problem is we can all call that out, and it should have been called out much earlier. As a matter of fact, somebody from the government should have said something over the weekend. But here's the most important thing. It's time for these protesters to go home. The people in the core of the city in Ottawa, and even farther out, they don't feel safe in the place that they live. I'm really having a hard time trying to understand why the Premier couldn't simply say that today when he put that release out. They need to be sent a very clear message.
And we had asked the Premier, we should note, for comment on Saturday, on Sunday. Today, he released a statement. Mr. Harden, were you expecting to hear from an elected leader, at least in Ottawa, at some point over the weekend?
Absolutely. I mean, I can't keep up to, I'm sure the same is true for John, I can't keep up to the calls coming into our office, to the emails, to the messages. We're doing our best. But I began hopeful that people were coming to Ottawa to express their upset around vaccinations, around mask policy. We have demonstrations in Parliament all the time, outside on the grass all the time. What we don't have are people walking in en masse to buses, unmasked. We do not have situations in which people serving coffee in Tim Hortons or other cafes in Ottawa are threatened by patrons who refuse to wear masks. This is organized. This isn't a protest. This is, at this point, organized harassment. And I expect better of the Premier of this province. We have, working for the province of Ontario, health inspectors, public health inspectors, workplace safety inspectors, road safety inspectors. That provincial infrastructure needs to be scrambled now to make sure people engaging in antisocial, unlawful activities that are, as John said, making people feel unsafe in their own community are held accountable. We needed the Premier to tell those folks to go home, and for the folks who are persisting to stay in what is not a protest, but organized harassment, there needs to be consequences for that.
We want to bring in Tim Avery. He's a Ottawa resident. Tim, you went for a walk in your neighborhood in Ottawa today, and you shared on social media some videos of your encounter with these demonstrators who are still there. You also wrote that there is a void of leadership in this city. Can you tell us what happened to you?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I have a child that goes to a school in the neighborhood, and I was just simply going out to see for myself what the state of things were, that there had been trucks camped along the Queen Elizabeth driveway here in the city all weekend. And that's a road, for those that don't live here, that runs along the canal, but it runs alongside a residential neighborhood, and I live half a block from that. It had been filled with trucks all weekend, and so I was stepping out just to see whether there were still trucks there and what the route to school looked like. And a lot of the trucks had disappeared, thankfully. But when I got farther up the driveway, north, closer to the hill, there were still obviously trucks there. They were parked alongside the high school. They were parked all the way up the driveway. So I followed it up, and I was just taking a few pictures of things because I get in touch, as Joel will tell you, I get in touch with Joel regularly. I'm in regular conversation with my city councillors, and I wanted to document what was going on there. So I just had my phone in my pocket. I walked under the Laurier Bridge, which is a bridge that runs, it's a major throughway across the city. It's a city street, but it divides kind of the very north end of the city from the residential neighborhood south of it. So I walked under that bridge. There's a park on the other side that's right beside the National Arts Center. And I was just stepping into the park, and there were a number of camper vans and trucks that had set up camp next to the canal and next to the pathway. And the second I stepped onto that property and pulled out my phone, someone came at me, and the video shows you the rest, that they immediately threw their hand across the front of my camera and told me to leave. And I was standing on public property. So I just asked them why, what was it that they needed for me, that it was not okay for me to walk into the park.
So Joel, talk more about what you saw and heard this weekend. O'Toole releasing a statement today saying that we saw only a handful of unacceptable incidents. Was that your experience of what went down?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I didn't actually see these things with my own eyes. What I'm telling you are experiences I've heard from constituents. I'm not sure if I'm hearing somebody here. Sorry, one moment here. The issues that I've been hearing have been from constituents, and they've been telling me straight up that they don't feel safe in their own communities. And earlier, I was urging the Premier to scramble provincial resources to deal with this. I also hope the Prime Minister is paying attention to these events and doing more than lamenting the activities of the protesters. I understand that the organization that's organized this protest is a registered nonprofit. If that's the case, the federal government has the power under the Canada Revenue Agency to investigate this organization that apparently has almost $8.5 million and compel them, not the taxpayers of Canada and the city, to pay for this mess. I mean, it's absolutely untenable that people would feel unsafe in their workplaces, unsafe in their neighborhoods, that families who proudly have pride flags outside their homes have their windows smashed and feces around the front yard, that paramedics feel compelled to ask for a police escort to enter into the downtown. This isn't a protest. This is organized harassment. And what I'm calling upon the Premier of Ontario and the Prime Minister of Canada to do is to hold these folks accountable. Any other organization doing anything like this would be held accountable, and we can't have people sitting on their hands while this happens.
And we are hearing from Ottawa city officials today, the police saying that these trucks could be weapons, that they need to de-escalate, that things could get more violent than they already have. The police chief saying that it's been a success for the last few days because there haven't been any injuries or violence. John, how does a leader interrupt these developments, and when should they have stepped in?
Well, look, we have to rely on the people who understand public safety and policing. And this is a dangerous situation. There's a lot of unknowns here. We have a lot of civil disobedience, lawlessness, and disorder. It's not a good situation. And the first thing that the Premier of Ontario needed to do, which he's done on many other occasions for other protests, is to say, look, enough is enough. It's time you leave. You've said your piece. And I've heard him use far more colorful language in other situations, far less serious than this one. And for the Premier and his government to be absent from the city that Tim and Joel and I and so many other people in the city love and call home is just simply unforgivable.
What about the Prime Minister, John?
Prime Minister came out very clearly on Friday about concerns over the protest. Mr. Ford had nothing to say. The Prime Minister said today exactly what was going on here. It's time for people to go home. But
Rashmi, with all due respect to my friend John, I mean, the Prime Minister's also been stoking the fire here by calling this group of folks who have their opinions a lot of names during the federal election and even now. And what I would actually like beyond the name calling is some actual concrete. Residents of Ottawa Centre are contacting me and they're telling me, where are the consequences? So we the Revenue Canada officials have the power to investigate this entity that's organized this protest. The Premier has staff that can deal with infractions that are public health emergencies, workplace emergencies. I refuse to accept that there can't be consequences for these. I take what John's saying to heart. It's a dangerous situation, but we can't let people just camp out in trucks, walk into workplaces unmasked, make people feel unsafe. There has to be an answer to this, and we need action.
I'm glad that you agree. It's a dangerous situation because it's more dangerous than people. Sorry, Tim, but it's a more dangerous situation than people. I think people are just discovering that. So.
But are we creating that dangerous atmosphere? Yes. Are we creating that dangerous atmosphere by allowing it to unfold? If the police on day 4 are saying these trucks are weapons, why were they rolled in on Friday afternoon? Tim, I wonder, as a resident, who did you expect leadership from and when?
I expected leadership from our municipal government for sure, and from our chief of police, but what we got instead was a lot of very soft reassurances that this would be just fine. Now, I mean, in my time when I'm not taking a walk in my neighborhood, I study democracy, I teach Canadian politics and democratic theory at a university level. I'm a 25-year communications consultant, and one of my specialties is crisis communications. And this conversation over the last week has been ridiculous. And now what we're getting over the last couple of days is a lot of public officials who realize that they have screwed up badly, and they're all either blaming one another or they are covering their asses by pointing to all the great things that have been done. The bottom line is they've been told for a week that this aimless protest was coming to town and that it was going to be an issue. We have seen these people before. They occupied our cenotaph for close to a year, and it took forever to finally get them out of there. And here we are. We're back again, and we're in a state where people like me, who are just minding our own business, walking through a park, like there are thousands of high school students a couple of hundred meters away from this who walk through that park every day. And my assault was witnessed by police officers, and they did nothing. That tells me that there is a complete lack of leadership. There is a complete lack of direction about what it is that police officers should and shouldn't be doing in the course of serving and protecting their community. And it's time the leaders stop blaming one another and step up and start de-escalating this situation and sending these people home.
All right, a fiery conversation, lots to follow here. We'll have to leave it there for now, guys. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, thank you all for making time.
If we were at 3 million, that's probably a realistic best case scenario. Then we would see a little bit of a rebound relatively, late in early March or so, but it would never reach the situation we've been in just right now. This would be, the best case scenario. And it will now really depend on the next few weeks for us to see where we are.
Ontario's COVID-19 Science Advisory Table is providing an updated snapshot of how this province is tackling the Omicron wave. Experts say it appears Omicron has plateaued, but they warn a lack of testing in this province makes it challenging to model transmission. Hospitalizations are at an all-time high across all age groups, as well as ICU admissions. The data shows vaccination, including third doses, provides strong protection against serious illness. And it also shows the pandemic continues to strain acute care. This as hospital staffing issues remain at a critical point. For more on all of this, we are joined by Dr. Fahad Razak, a member of the COVID-19 Science Advisory Table. We appreciate you making time this evening, Doctor. Let's start with the limitations in being able to model transmission because of a lack of testing in this province. What was that like for the Science Advisory Table when putting this data together?
Yeah, it made it very challenging. So I would say this is by far the most challenging modeling the table has had to put together. And, it's primarily being driven by two factors. The first is the breakdown in testing in the province. So, starting a few weeks ago, we don't know how many people were infected. The second is the transmissibility of Omicron meant that there was huge numbers of people who were infected. Many of them had prior vaccinations, so had relatively mild infections, so probably wouldn't have been tested anyway. So those two things together makes estimates going forward very challenging, and we have to start relying on other measurements like wastewater measurement, which means the amount of the virus genetic signal we can see in wastewater. looking at things like how many people are positive in a hospital, looking at employers who do testing. All of these gives you some picture of the overall situation in the province, but each is a lot more imperfect than just looking at case rates, which we can no longer rely on, unfortunately.
And when we do look at hospitals, this modeling suggests that the Omicron wave may be plateauing, but the situations in our hospitals are dire.
They're very tough, and they're tough for a couple of reasons. The number of people in hospital lags the rise in cases. So even though the peak has occurred probably for cases at this point, we're still going to see the trickle in of people into hospitals over the next days to weeks. The second factor is once they're in hospital, many people, especially unvaccinated, are extremely ill, and they stay in hospital for a very long time. I just came off of our hospital wards last week, and we had people who had been in for 4 or 5 weeks after their initial infection because of how sick they were. So once they come in, they stay in hospital for a much longer period of time. The final part is staffing. I've never in my career seen our staffing stretched to the extent that it is. And I would say at St. Michael's, where I am, we're not nearly as bad off as some of our community sites, which are in very, very difficult situations. So you have all of these factors together, meaning that hospitals are still feeling extraordinary amounts of strain.
And how long can that strain continue?
I mean, I think all of us would have said less than what it's already continued for. It's already 2 years into this process. And what you're seeing is a combination of people getting sick in hospital. I'm talking about the healthcare workers now, burnout from the amount of hours that they've worked over the last few years. It's a combination of factors, and Canada historically has already had very limited resources in the hospital sector. We have very few beds relative to comparison countries like European countries. We have relatively low staffing levels. It means we're always on a razor's edge. We had problems like hallway medicine even before the pandemic, and so this has really just tipped us over. So it's a combination of all these factors together.
And how about vaccinations? Should people still feel that sense of urgency to get their second or third dose?
Absolutely. If you look at the data, the degree of protection an individual will have if they receive 2 doses, and even more if they've received 3 doses, remains remarkable even against Omicron. This is really actually quite amazing considering how mutated Omicron is relative to the original strain of the virus we developed vaccines for. But today in Ontario, based on real data, even if you've just had 2 doses of vaccine, the chance you'll end up in hospital is reduced by more than 80%. The chance that you'll end up in the ICU is reduced by more than 90%. And like I said, with a 3rd dose, it's even stronger. So vaccination for an individual gives you an enormous amount of protection. It also means that all of the other stuff we're suffering from in society, worries about schools, the economy, those things can move forward much quicker if you are vaccinated, if more people are vaccinated.
The vaccination rates are slowing among all age groups right now. So when we look at these projections from the Science Advisory Table, best case scenario is most people vaccinated. Worst case scenario, what are we looking at in the weeks ahead, Doctor?
So the 3rd dose vaccination rates are where there's a real slowdown right now. The 2nd dose rates had risen tremendously quickly over the fall, plateaued. They're trickling up very, very slowly now, but there's not as much room because of the remaining people. Many people will probably not get vaccinated by choice. But the 3rd dose vaccine, there's still a lot of room, and especially for children, there's a lot of room to get that 2nd dose in. So there are these pockets we really need to focus on. We need to get our young kids vaccinated, especially get that 2nd dose in. We need to get the 3rd dose in, especially for our vulnerable adults. So underlying health conditions, older in age, living in a high-risk setting like a long-term care center or a shelter. Those are the people we really need to get that 3rd dose into.
Especially when you consider the reopening of the province. How did that factor in with the data?
So, you know, I always say when I'm answering about the reopening, any of the reopening phases we've had, obviously the pressures around reopening are not just about science and numbers. There is the economy. There's the fact that people are suffering from social isolation. The best that we can say from the modeling is that reopening is going to cause a rise in numbers. But even that is very uncertain, again, because of the lack of monitoring data now over the last few weeks. But our best model suggests that probably there's going to be a rise in cases again, a rise in people in hospitals, coming into hospitals, and a rise of people going into the ICUs. Now, As long as that stays within a reasonable band, we should be able to manage. But remember, we're just starting the process now of reopening all of those surgeries that have been put on hold weeks and months over the last couple of years. They've been put on hold. Some of these people are suffering tremendously. And for those surgeries to go at full pace, we need to have enough capacity in hospital to care for people. And so that's the really other important thing to keep an eye on now.
And enough staff thinking about all those healthcare workers out there. Dr. Fahad Razak, we appreciate your time tonight. Thank you so much.
Good to be with you.
I'm sure that our police, all of them working together, will do the job they have to do to keep everybody safe. And you just hope that those who are protesting, sort of have a measure of common sense and consideration for others in exercising their rights. One of the things that I say all the time is that, everybody's rights, which we treasure and which we protect and which we, uphold, also interferes or intersects, rather, with other people's rights from time to time. And you have to achieve that balance.
They've got a bit of a blueprint happening from two perspectives: how Ottawa's handled it, what's worked and what hasn't so far, and how the truckers have a blueprint, what worked for them and what hasn't worked so far. So everybody's learning from this. So when it unfolds, you try to apply all those learnings. But the bottom line is, if you've got hundreds of people to be arrested, think back to G20, how do you do that? Where do you put them? How do you process them, release them? And what follows in terms of the sympathetic protests that follow? And suddenly it's way bigger than it started out to be.
As a protest against vaccine mandates continues for a 6th straight day in Ottawa today, Toronto police say they're preparing to respond to a planned truckers' protest here this weekend. A flyer circulating on social media suggests a Convoy for Freedom demonstration will take place at Queen's Park at noon on Saturday. Organizers are asking supporters to show up at one of 7 GTA meeting points before making their way downtown, and this prompting concerns about gridlock and public safety here in the city. So how effective was Ottawa Police's strategy, and what can we do here in Toronto to prepare? To discuss, we welcome our panel tonight, former Ottawa Police Chief Charles Bordelot and Restaurants Canada Vice President of Central Canada, James Rylett. Thanks to both of you. Charles, let's start with what's happening in Ottawa today. What are you hearing and seeing on the streets?
Well, certainly this isn't something that Ottawa has ever seen in my lifetime and my 35-year policing career. The sheer size, the dynamics, the volatility, the trucks. Basically, what they've done is they've taken over our downtown core, and it has impacted the livelihood of our residents, our businesses. They can't sleep. They've got noise. They've got smells from diesel fuels. We have incidents involving the protesters in the downtown core. They desecrated the War Memorial, the Terry Fox statue. There have been reported assaults. There have been hate crimes in our city, in the downtown core. So it's pretty well paralyzed our downtown core. Now, Ottawa is the site of hundreds of demonstrations every year, but certainly we've never seen anything of this size and scope. And it's not bad if they come through as a convoy and they leave. They decided to stay, and that's causing a big problem from a public safety perspective and a quality of life for our residents in the downtown core.
The worst you've ever seen. Wow. So let's talk more about the impact here, James. This, of course, has been a really tough month for businesses. They were finally allowed to reopen on Monday, but most in Ottawa did not.
Yeah, a lot of the downtown restaurants, they were ready to go. They had stocked up with food. They had their staff ready to go, and they just weren't allowed to open. The convoys blocked their businesses, or they harassed their customers, which was very unfortunate. I think there's a lot of restaurants that feel for the message, and they don't have a problem with the protest. They just have a problem with having to continue to be closed in this time where they've suffered through 2 years of losses.
So let's talk about the strategy here, Charles. Police were asked earlier this week, why not ticket and tow those vehicles? Why not be more forceful in moving people out? So talk about Ottawa Police's strategy here. Did it work?
Well, I think it's too soon to say if it worked or not, but what I can tell you from my experience, their strategy is working. It is having an effect because they've been successful by negotiating with the demonstrators in significantly reducing the number of protesters in the core, and also significantly reducing the number of trucks that have been left in the core. So now there's about 200 demonstrators and 500 trucks, which is a more manageable number. But unfortunately, it's still having a huge impact on the downtown core in our city. The challenge is when you go in and start removing individuals and arresting people, there's the risk for violence and injuries is far greater than having to negotiate. So police are very careful and being very strategic as to when and where they will start removing vehicles and removing protesters. But the challenge that they are now faced with is if they remove everybody, there's information and intelligence that says that this is a more of a North American movement, that there may be some more protesters coming back to the Capitol, even from the United States. So once you remove them, how do you prevent them from coming back and blocking your streets again? That's the bigger challenge that the police service and the city is now faced with.
Right. And to that point, Ottawa police today in a late afternoon news conference were saying they're preparing for a large number of these people to come back into the city this weekend. And there are some concerns now that we could see a repeat. So will the strategy be the same, Charles, as what we saw last weekend? Or do you expect police to use some amount of force in the situation?
The chief has been very clear that criminal behavior will not be tolerated and police will act. However, with respect to the demonstration, for them to go in and use force with such a large number of demonstrators and trucks, that's a recipe for disaster, because we've experienced in other demonstrations across Canada, in the world, where the police have gone in to start arresting people and it turns violent. And that is not something that our city and our police service wants to have take place.
So there are some viral images we've been seeing, Charles. There's one in particular of, a convoy of trucks, and there are police officers in front with a thumbs up. And I think that rubs a lot of folks the wrong way. So tell us about images like that, what that says, and are there concerns about officer safety in those situations?
There's no questions that there have been videos and photos that have circulated that haven't made the optics look so good. However, there are also some photos that have been misinterpreted, and people have assumed that, for example, police officers were delivering food to the demonstrators, which is that did not happen. However, the chief made it very clear that officers have to remain professional. They need to be neutral in their approach. And I think it's a good thing that they're building rapport with the demonstrators, because that can work in their favor as far as building a relationship. But they have to remain neutral, and they have to remain professional in doing a very difficult job in a very challenging environment when volatility is very close by.
Okay, so conversations obviously underway here in Toronto about TPS's response. James, want to bring you in again and ask what you're hearing about how businesses in Toronto are preparing for this weekend's protest.
I don't think businesses know what to expect. I think they're preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. It's a little different in the downtown core than Ottawa. It's the Parliament here is a little separated from the downtown core, so hopefully they'll focus just on the Parliament building, the legislative building. But we don't know. We don't know what the size will be. Like I said, restaurants are just getting back into the swing of things. All businesses really are just hoping to get back into it. And the last thing we need right now is the first weekend we can be open to be affected by something like this.
Yeah, tough to know what to expect. Charles, Toronto Police releasing a statement today saying the service will have a policing operation in place to ensure public safety and keep emergency access routes to hospitals clear. Over the coming days, we will continue to liaise with organizers and partner agencies. So, Charles, talk to us about whether there were any lessons learned from Ottawa Police this week, and how should Toronto Police be preparing right now?
It's way too early to determine whether or not there were lessons learned. I'm sure that after every event, there's a debriefing, and I'm sure there will also be plenty of people providing their advice to the Ottawa Police Service in the city on how well it was managed and what they can learn from. But I can tell you that police managing major events continues to evolve, and there's always opportunities to do better. Toronto Police, I'm sure, are in conversation with the Ottawa Police Service in order to better prepare themselves as to what may come. But sounds like in Toronto, they're going to be driving by, and there appears to be no indication that they're going to be staying. The challenge in Ottawa is that they've decided to stay.
Okay, lots to follow here. Thanks to both of you. We so appreciate your time and perspective on this.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is, in fact, the term of council where we are focused on housing. We really are at a crossroads where if we don't take substantive steps today to address our housing crisis, the future sustainability of this city is in jeopardy. You know, we're at a point now where if you make the median income in the city of Toronto, it is increasingly difficult for you to find somewhere to live that you can afford. So options like garden suites, as we roll those out across our big city, those provide more options for more people in more neighborhoods.
We just hear people saying, I can't afford to stay in the city anymore. Or my kids grew up in this neighborhood, they'll never be able to afford a place here. Or people that are selling their homes, older people, they might not want to move out of the city. So this is a really great idea for families. There's only 200 of them. We're doing a pilot and see how successful it's going to be. We did pass laneway suites, but you had to live on a lane. With these houses, you don't have to have them on a lane, but they have to be scaled to the property.
So Toronto City Council is increasing the supply and type of housing available in the city, and it doesn't mean more high-rises. Toronto homeowners can now build garden suites on their residential properties. The city describes it as a housing unit that's usually located in one's backyard, and it's typically separate and detached from the main house. Councillors say the suites can be used to house more family members or as rental units.
And before this new policy, only properties next to a public lane were allowed to build a separate residential unit. So how might this affect Toronto's skyrocketing housing costs, and how might it impact anyone who might live next door? For more, let's bring in Anna Bilo, Toronto's Deputy Mayor, City Councillor for Ward 9, and the Chair of the Planning and Housing Committee. We're also joined by Kevin Krieger, the President of the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board. Both of you, thanks for joining us tonight. Anna, to you first. Take us through the timeline of this new housing policy, and kind of what are some of the restrictions when it comes to these specific garden suites that are not just next to a lane.
Well, back in 2018, we approved laneway housing in the Toronto and East York Community Council. In 2019, we extended that across the city, and we started looking at garden suites for the lots that do not back into a laneway. How can we allow those people to have a dwelling unit that is not in the main house? And so staff have been consulting. There was a lot of consultation done with residents associations, with people that participated through surveys. And so now council approved it. It's finally approved, and very shortly people will be able to go and take a building permit. And if they comply with the design guidelines that were approved at council, they will be able to just take a building permit like they do today for a garage or for a laneway house and build a garden suite.
So on that note, Councillor Bilo, I'll put this to you as the person responsible for the city's affordable housing, at least on behalf of council. Is there that much interest in these garden suites? I mean, how many people have raised their hands saying they want to build one?
It's an option. It's not going to be, you're not going to have thousands of this over the next few months, right? We've seen it with the gardens, with the laneway houses. So since 2018, between what's been built and what's now in the pipeline, you're a bit over 300. It's picking up. More people are seeing it build. They're curious. They're calling. They're getting information. They're finding out that they can do it. And so it'll be a gradual change. But what we're finding is more and more people, because of the cost of housing in Toronto, they're looking for this space to, maybe house that, 25-year-old that a few decades ago was probably able to be living on their own already, that now is having a really tough time to be on their own in Toronto, or aging parents, or, I've had families in my house that siblings bought together, and, a family's living in the laneway house, another family is living in the main house, and people that want to supplement their income with rental as well. So it's about options. It's about gradual change into our neighborhoods. And it's a tool in the toolbox. It's not going to solve the housing situation, but it adds, right? There's not one solution that would solve housing. We need many actions on the housing continuum to tackle housing.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin, what do you think this means for the constantly rising rents we're seeing in Toronto?
Well, I completely agree with Councillor Bilow. This is one of what hopefully will be many, many tools coming forward from Council. But anything really that adds additional housing units to the market is incredibly important. We obviously see a lot of conversation now specifically around the ownership end of housing and lack of affordability for purchased properties. But there is also, as you mentioned, a desperate need for rentals. The rental cost in Toronto has substantially increased throughout the pandemic. And anything we can do in the way of laneway houses, certainly garden suites, and potentially looking at different options for other types of gentle intensification like plex housing, duplex, triplex, fourplex, and looking at opportunities to streamline that process from Council would be incredibly well received.
Deputy Mayor and Councillor Bilow, in terms of short-term rentals, Airbnb, is this a rental unit? Does this count as part of your principal residence? How does that fit into this?
Yeah, so this counts as it's a rental unit. So you cannot put it at a short-term rental in the market. It's like you have a secondary suite in your house. It's the same thing. So the tenant, the person that lives in there, if they go away on vacation, they can have it some days on the short-term rental, but you cannot build one of these just for short-term rental. The same rules apply as for the short-term rentals.
Mm-hmm. And I also wanted to ask you, knowing that, do you have any concerns when it comes to some of the issues we've seen with short-term rentals in other areas of the city and in other types of housing in the city? Things like loud parties, other noise concerns, possible negative impacts on neighbors. Any concerns there?
No, I mean, we have strong short-term rental regulations that came into effect that seem to be taking a positive step towards some of those issues. We required to be somebody's principal residence, so either the owner is on site or, it's their home, so people are a little bit more careful. So not so much concerned about that. I think that we have quite a bit of inspectors working on that policy. So I don't think that will be a concern. If I could add just one thing on this issue, I think that what Kevin said about the supply is really important. And when we talk about supply in a city that is going to grow by 25% over the next 30 years, and where we have 50% of our area that is zoned residential, right? Where you have residentials, everything else, you have roads and parks and employment and so on. And 35% of that is our neighborhoods. So we are only growing now in 50% of our land. So if we don't allow for solutions like this to have a gentle intensification in some of our neighborhoods, can you imagine what our city is going to be? Yeah. It's going to be a peaks of 80-story buildings and single-family homes. So what we're actually telling people is, here are some other options for you to deal with your family situation, your economic situation, the housing situation, but also a little bit a different way for us to grow as a city that is more equitable, that is more across the border, that is not going to put just so much pressure in 15% of the land, that we're actually all going to benefit for the vibrancy of really good communities.
Deputy Mayor, I wanted to briefly also ask you about enforcement, because obviously with more homes and more rentals and short-term rentals, you're going to have more enforcement. What's the plan in place? Are there going to be more bylaw inspectors and officers on the streets? Is there a plan? Does the city have a plan to hire more inspectors right off the bat? How's that going to work?
So like I said, we have created regulations for short-term rentals. We have hired and created a process to deal with that. This Garden Suites is not going to add thousands of units. Like I said, laneway housing, we're about hitting now the 300 between the ones that have been built and the permits. So we're not going to have thousands of units.
But what if that changes over time? What's the plan over the next couple of years?
The city is growing. The city is growing. We are growing. Garden suites, condos, everything. We are growing. There's 700,000 people coming to our city. So we have to grow. We are growing. We need it for our economic vitality. We need to attract jobs. We need to maintain our workers in our city. We are a city that is a vibrant city, and we need to grow. So we have strong short-term rentals, with enforcement, with additional resources that we've hired, and we'll continue to monitor. So one of the things that council did is that the team at Municipal License and Standards that deals with short-term rentals needs to report to council on a regular basis to make sure that we're getting the results that we intended when we created all these regulations and all these extra bodies to be inspecting this, to make sure that we're getting the results that the residents of Toronto want us to get, which is create a strong short-term rental, but not take housing away from the market.
Kevin, final question for you. I mean, backyards are a hot commodity in the city, especially if you have one large enough to create something like a garden suite. Are home buyers going to be like, well, are home buyers going to consider the garden suite a plus, or think, wow, you just took away from my backyard space? I mean, I guess it depends on the buyer, but what do you think?
Well, yeah, I think it definitely... sorry.
It's okay. Deputy Mayor, I just want to put the final question to Kevin.
I think it definitely depends on the buyer perspective for sure. For someone who's looking at a property that ultimately will house a garden suite, I think they're looking for potentially an additional source of revenue to obviously supplement their cost of running the property. As well, we're certainly seeing a trend towards multi-generational families purchasing properties together. As the councillor mentioned as well, we're seeing siblings that are buying properties together. Mm-hmm. So properties that have garden suites ultimately will open up a new class of opportunity in the city, certainly will provide additional type of housing. And the biggest factor, and I couldn't agree with Councillor Moore, is we need additional housing units. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a brilliant move on the part of council to look at gentle versions of intensification that can come to market quickly. This isn't dependent on a 5-year planning process. It's certainly not going to bring a large number of units to market at one time, but it's something that a mom and pop investor, a mom and pop homeowner can do as an additional investment or an improvement to their existing property. And we're basically making use of supplemental land in neighborhoods.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Kevin Krigger, Deputy Mayor, Anna Bailo, thank you both so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Yo.